As you know, we've had this trend in North Carolina over the last few election cycles where we're really developing into one of the most competitive states politically in the country. In 2008, we were the second closest state in the presidential race, and then we were the second closest state in the presidential race again in 2012. And that trend of the state really being divided right down the middle is something that we're continuing to see going into 2014. So I'm going to sort of go over the lay of the land politically, but also then backtrack a little bit, because even though we were really closely divided in 2012 and we're really closely divided now, that doesn't mean that nothing's changed in the last 15 months. 2013 was actually a very unusually volatile year politically in this state for a non-election year, where we really saw things going up and down and up and down, and I'll get into sort of some of why that is. But one thing that's going to distinguish North Carolina in 2014 really from any time in recent history is that we are one of the 2 or 3 most important states in the country politically this year. Even though we were very competitive in 2008 and 2012, what happened in North Carolina wasn't having that big of an impact on the national picture. Whether Barack Obama won North Carolina or not in 2008 and 2012, it was just sort of the question of winning by a lot or winning by even more in the Electoral College. The state was close, but it wasn't really affecting the balance of power. And even in 2008, when Kay Hagan beat Elizabeth Dole to get elected to the U.S. Senate, that was just the difference between Democrats having 57, 58 seats in the Senate, having 58, 59 seats in the Senate. It was a win Democrats were certainly happy with, but it wasn't going to affect whether they had control of the Senate or not. But this year, control of the Senate really may come down to our North Carolina Senate race. And once again, just like in 2008 and just like in 2012, this is going to be one of the 2 or 3 closest Senate races in the entire country. One thing that makes life difficult for Democrats when it comes to control of the U.S. Senate in 2014 is that in 2008, they won pretty much everything with Obama on the ballot. They won all the competitive races across the country. So what that means when you look at the 2014 election cycle is that almost all the competitive seats are places that Democrats are having to defend it. And there's not a ton of opportunities for Democrats to try to beat a Republican incumbent and pick up a seat. Right off the bat, Democrats are looking at losing 3 Senate seats in West Virginia, Montana, and South Dakota, where Democratic incumbents have retired. They're states that Mitt Romney won by double digits in 2012. And we're finding that Republicans have huge advantages for those seats. So pretty much right off the bat, Republicans are picking up 3 seats in the U.S. Senate. And that means that to keep control, Democrats have to win 2 seats out of these 4 states where they are defending this fall. And the 4 states where they need to win 2 to keep control are Alaska, Louisiana, Arkansas, and North Carolina. Alaska, Mitt Romney won by 14 points. Louisiana, Mitt Romney won by, I think, 16 points. Arkansas, Mitt Romney won by 26 points. North Carolina, Mitt Romney only won by 2 points. So out of those 4 seats where Democrats really have to win 2 to keep control, this is the one that sets up best for them in terms of the overall political climate, and that's why it's virtually, if Kay Hagan loses, Republicans are going to have control of the Senate. If Kay Hagan wins, then maybe Democrats can also pick up one of those other 3 seats and stay in control. And that's why you've seen so much advertising so early this year in the Senate races, because this is the place that's going to determine whether Harry Reid continues on in power or if Mitch McConnell becomes the majority leader if he wins re-election. And right now, the North Carolina Senate race couldn't be closer. The last 3 months, when we test Kay Hagan against her potential Republican opponents, it's within 2 or 3 points, one way or the other, for her against every single one of them. I mean, it's really as much of a toss-up as it can be at this point. And what we're seeing in this race, which has become increasingly common as the country's gotten more and more polarized over the last 2 years, is that voters don't really like Kay Hagan, but they don't really like any of the Republican candidates either. So it sort of turns into a lesser of two evils calculation. Right now, we're finding that Kay Hagan's approval rating's about 38%, her disapproval rating's about 48%. Not coincidentally, when we ask people what they think about Obamacare, the approval rating for that's about 38%, the disapproval rating for that's about 48%. What's happened over the last 3 or 4 months as Republicans have attacked Hagan early is that voters' feelings about her and voters' feelings about Obamacare have kind of become one and the same. I mean, it's really amazing how close of a correlation there is in those numbers. And that's caused this race to become much more of a toss-up than it had been previously. Over the summer, before the difficulties with the Obamacare rollout and when the Republicans in the legislature had thoroughly antagonized voters in the state, over the course of the summer, we were finding Hagan up 10 to 15 points in matchups with her potential Republican opponents. And then once the anger about what was happening in Raleigh sort of got outweighed in the average voter's mind by anger about what was happening with Obamacare, and as the anger over what happened in the legislative session sort of dissipated a little bit among the average voter because it just wasn't, in the headlines every day like it had been. We just saw this abrupt, very major shift from a race where Hagan had a pretty strong advantage to this one that's now a toss-up. And it's also a situation where not just Obamacare, but people's feelings about Obama himself are having a big impact on Hagan's fortune. His approval ratings dropped by 10 points over a couple months period of time. Hagan's dropped by 10 points over a couple months period of time. And it's very much the case that what we've seen during Obama's time in the White House is that when Obamacare is in the news, that's when Obama has his lowest numbers in the state. It may be that long-term Obamacare, proves to be a success and people really feel like it's working, but that's not where it is right now. And what that means is that for Obama and Hagan and Democrats in North Carolina to succeed, they really need the conversation to sort of move on to something else. And I think that's starting to happen a little bit. And some of the issues that Senator Hagan and Democrats nationally are emphasizing this year really do play well with the public. When you talk about the possibility of increasing the minimum wage to $10 an hour, which is a key theme of Democratic campaigns across the country, we find about 60% support for that. And it's something where Democrats are pretty unanimously on board with it, but you also see about a third of Republicans who say, this is something we should do. And that's more sort of crossover support than we're tending to see for any sort of policy thing right now. Senator Hagan put a focus last month on extending unemployment benefits, and that's something where we see even more support for her position. About 65% of voters in the state think unemployment benefits should continue. Only 25-30% think they should be cut off, and that's something else where you really see independents sort of more in line with how Hagan feels about that issue than how the Republicans do. So the issue set for 2014, I think, is shaping up better for Hagan. It's just a question of whether voters are going to sort of feel like those things are important as Obamacare, which has proved really problematic. I know there's a general assumption that Kay Hagan's opponent this fall will be Tom Tillis, and he is leading in the Republican primary right now, but what's really interesting is that most voters, and I know this is sometimes hard for people like us to believe who sort of eat and breathe this stuff every day, but most voters have never heard of any of the Republican candidates for the Senate. Even Tillis, with as much attention as he's drawn as Speaker of the House, 2/3 of North Carolinians have never even heard of him. So what that does is put the Republican primary field relatively wide open. Right now we're finding that about 40% of Republican primary voters are undecided about who they want their candidate to be. And that's sort of been a constant, and we always say, well, the primary's so far off, the primary's so far off. Now the primary is really not that far off. We're only 3 months away, but still 40% of voters undecided about that. Tillis has the lead with 20% and then the rest of the candidates are all clustered around 10%. If the people who are undecided right now sort of made up their mind proportionately to the people who have already decided, that would only put Tillis at 34%, which would put this into a runoff. And I think in 2010, when there was a runoff in the U.S. Senate race for the Democrats, it really did sort of set them back in terms of trying to take on Richard Burr, because you had another 6 weeks where you were running against each other instead of running against your Republican opponent. There's a decent chance that's going to happen the other way around this time. It's just going to be a question of whether Greg Brannon and Mark Harris have enough resources to really build up support and keep Tillis below 40% in the primary. But right now, that's a pretty wide open contest. I'm good. Sort of turning the attention to the state level, voters really don't like anybody when it comes to that. Governor McCrory went in the span of 6 months from being one of the most popular governors in the country to being one of the least popular governors in the country. And he is now, when we look at our approval ratings on every governor in the country, he's in the bottom 10 in terms of how people feel about him, which is kind of an amazing drop from somebody who won independents 2-1 in 2012, won about 30% of the Democratic vote, and all of that crossover popularity he had has now pretty much gone away. Voters really saw him in the 2008 election as a different kind of Republican, and that was why he was able to get so much support from moderates and Democrats and independents. And after the way that he conducted himself in the legislative session last year, that just went out the window, and we now find his approval ratings in the 30s. He's in sort of the 35 to 40% range, and over 50% of voters disapprove of him. We're a tough act here in North Carolina. We did a poll last month asking people not just what they thought about McCrory, but also what they thought of every other living governor, or living former governor. And we don't like Governor Perdue, we don't like Governor Easley, we do like Governor Hunt and Governor Martin. So as long as you've been out of office for more than 10 years, we'll like you. Any sort of contemporary standing, there's some difficulty. So McCrory's unpopular. You would think that would put Democrats in a really good position for this fall at the state level, but we really find a split there as well. Certainly the Republicans in the legislature are unpopular, but voters don't like the Democrats in the legislature either. And the question again of sort of losing the momentum that Democrats had built up over the summer with the popularity of the Moral Monday movements and stuff like that. In July, we found that if there was an election for the legislature today, people would vote Democratic by an 11-point margin. Now that's back to a tie, and it's because so much of how people vote at the state level is determined by how they're feeling about things at the federal level. It's just a simple reality of politics that what's going on in Washington, D.C. is almost always going to trump what's going on in Raleigh in voters' minds. So as voters became more unhappy with Obama, even though they're unhappy with McCrory, even though they're unhappy with the legislature too, they take that unhappiness with Obama out on people at the state level. And that's what happened in the 2010 election when Republicans got control for the first time to begin with. It was not because, it wasn't because they didn't like Joe Hatney or Mark Basnight, or even because they didn't like Governor Perdue. It was they didn't like Obama, so they just voted Republican up and down the board. And that's how that happened. So I think right now, if we had the election, Democrats would pick up some seats in the state Senate, would pick up some seats in the state House, but you're not talking about getting anywhere close to a majority with the way that the district lines are drawn up and this kind of thing. And frankly, I mean, it's a statement about just how gerrymandered the state is. Even when Democrats had an 11-point lead on the statewide legislative ballot, that still probably wouldn't have been enough to get a majority in the House or the Senate. The legislature is so gerrymandered that Democrats would have to win the statewide legislative vote by something close to 20 points to get control of the legislature, and that's incredibly unsmall d Democratic that's the case. But that's just where we are with these district maps as they are. So that's my basic overview, and I think that we're interested in taking your questions to the greatest extent possible. So I'll turn it over to Chris, and we'll take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming again. Chris Fitzsimon with NC Policy Watch. I don't know how Tom does all that and keeps all the numbers. And I couldn't even find my car keys today. I'm not going to talk too long because I think the whole point of this was so you could ask Tom questions and I can try to help if I can, and we can have comments and hear from each other. But I wanted to just tell you a little bit about maybe what I think is happening, a few things to look for in 2014, and then we'll open it up for questions. First, I want to put on my commentator hat for a second, which I get to do every so often. And what's fascinating to hear Tom talk about the U.S. Senate race is that in some ways, if the election were held today, in my mind, the whole question would be, would the lies being told about the Affordable Care Act be enough to overcome the outrage that people have about the Tea Party General Assembly? I mean, that would, to me, that's sort of what's defining the election these days. So the Tea Party General Assembly and their partners in the governor's mansion, I should point out. And yes, I did say partners, plural, Art Pope and Pat McCrory. And I hope that doesn't offend the real governor or Pat McCrory. And I'm no pollster or political scientist, but what's really interesting to think about, if Tom Tillis were the nominee this fall, which I think he probably will be ultimately, it really is the first time that people have a chance statewide to voice their displeasure at the polls about what happened in the General Assembly this year. With all the marches and everything, most people, as Tom mentioned, lived in these gerrymandered districts. And Tom Tillis really sort of the embodiment of the General Assembly. And something I think is really fascinating, if he is the nominee, the primary will be over. He'll be presiding as Speaker of the House in the short session of the General Assembly unless he steps down, and at the same time raising millions of dollars from contributors, many of whom have bills before the General Assembly. Right now it's against the law for Tillis to raise money as a sitting legislator, any sitting legislator, to raise money from lobbyists during the session or any time. But he's doing it already because he's raising it for a U.S. Senate race. So we might literally have a specter where we have a Speaker of the House, somebody presiding over what's happening in the General Assembly, being at the House one day, having a fundraiser with corporations the next night who want a bill passed in the General Assembly. So I think it's going to be fascinating. The other thing, and Tom already mentioned this, I think it's also interesting as just a sort of a political observer. If I was working in that battalion of press aides that Governor McCrory had, I think I'd be pretty worried. Not just because he's in the bottom 10, but think about what's happened in the last 6 months. Americans for the Prosperous, which is what we should call them, not Americans for Prosperity. Americans for the Prosperous has run hundreds of thousands of dollars of ads really against Obama. Allegedly against Gay Hagan. It's really about Obama and Obamacare. So they've beaten up Obama in North Carolina with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Several months, all fall, I think it was $800,000 or $600,000 was spent by McCrory's political organization boosting McCrory. And ads where he was talking about how great his agenda was. So we've had more than $1 million spent in the last 6 months attacking Gay Hagan and boosting the agenda of Pat McCrory, his popularity, and yet Obama and McCrory have the same approval rating, roughly, in North Carolina, even after all that money is spent. I think that says a lot about sort of where Pat McCrory is. That brings me to a little bit of 2014 and maybe what is the most important battle of all I think the entire year will be defined by not what happens in short session in the General Assembly, but how we frame or how it is framed what happened in 2013, what people actually think happened in 2013, whether or not people can remind the voters of what actually happened in 2013. And I'm not going to try to address everything that happened in 2013. This would turn into a dinner speech. I'd still be standing here. But if you just think back for a second, because sometimes I think we forget all these things. The General Assembly last year punished unemployed workers, demoralized teachers, made it harder for people to vote. They denied health care to 500,000 people by not expanding Medicaid. They took more health care rights away from women in a bill about motorcycle safety. They cut taxes on the wealthy and out-of-state corporations. They raised taxes on the working poor, most of us in this room. They dismantled environmental protections in the name of customer service, which I think is fascinating. The customer apparently now in North Carolina is only the corporations who want to drill or frack or spew, not the rest of us who want to breathe or drink clean water. They also took another major step toward dismantling public education at all levels with funding cuts and a new voucher scheme that literally sends our money. Everybody in this room will have their money diverted to completely unaccountable private and religious academies that openly discriminate against gay kids and their families, that teach students that the earth is a few thousand years old, and that most slaves were treated well. I'm not making that up. Lindsay Wagner has done a story at NC Policy Watch about a school called Paramount Christian Academy in Thomasville. It has one teacher, 3 students. It meets in a ramshackle addition to a house. that teaches all those things that I mentioned out of the Bob Jones textbooks. And if they want to, they can be eligible to receive our money to teach those kids. It's startling. And the legislators, I think Tillis and Berger and the folks who are running the General Assembly know that all those things are not popular. That's why, obviously, they're trying to change the topic and blame Obamacare and Medicaid for everything. In fact, if you were stuck in traffic today, Obamacare's fault. We have Adam Searing, who works at the Health Access Coalition, actually came down with the flu, and I told him, I've worked with him for a long time. He never had the flu until Obamacare passed. So something's going on. Let's talk about the short session for a second. I don't think too much is going to happen, although there will be a teacher raise. It's not new. We don't know how much it's going to be, or which teachers are going to get it, or how we're going to pay for it. But there will be a raise. We can talk about that some more if you want, but I think that's going to be their answer to, we hate public schools, is that we're going to give some teachers a raise. Although it's fascinating that McCrory has declined to endorse an idea by former Governor Hunt that we raise teachers' pay to the national average, which strikes me as a floor of our ambition, not a ceiling. And yet McCrory is unwilling to even go on the record and say we need to raise teacher salaries to the national average. I think the decision to put off the privatization of the North Carolina Department of Commerce until next fall is another indicator that this short session, their goal this short session is to come to town, give teachers a raise, try not to look as radical as they are or were last year, and then leave town. They need to appear less radical, and they need to spend most of their time instead trying to spin all the things that they did last year, which brings me to the so-called Carolina comeback, which Reverend Barber calls the Carolina cover-up. The News and Observer called it the Carolina dropout, with so many people leaving the labor force. I've been tempted in going back and forth trying to decide whether or not we should call it the Carolina con job. I will call it the Carolina job. It is true the unemployment rate has fallen 1.5% since December 2012. That's literally the basis of the Carolina con job. Unemployment rate has fallen 1.5%, and that's all because we've cut people off of unemployment, and we've cut taxes, and we've cut regulation, and we've stopped protecting the environment. All those things have led to this big economic boom in North Carolina. Well, here's the truth, and I hope you all know this already, but I think we can't emphasize this enough. Here's a few things that you need to know about the Carolina con job or comeback. Fewer jobs were created in North Carolina in 2013 than in 2012. Now let that sink in for a second. Fewer jobs were created in North Carolina in 2013 than were created in 2012. So maybe we should call it the Carolina come down. More than 100,000 people dropped out of the labor force last year in 2013. More than 100,000 people. They're so discouraged in their fruitless search for a job that they gave up looking, and they're no longer counted in the unemployment figures, and most of them unfortunately no longer get unemployment benefits to feed their families. So fewer jobs were created, 100,000 people gave up and stopped looking for work, and they're not counted anymore. That's why the unemployment rate, that's most of why the unemployment rate has dropped so significantly, not because of massive job creation, but because people simply can't find jobs no matter how hard they look. And that's not idle speculation. Those figures come from the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. They don't just come from me, and they don't actually just come from the Budget and Tax Center. I don't know if you saw an article in the News and Observer recently. They come from a series of economists, a guy who works at Wachovia Bank, an economist at a university, and even an economist named Mike Walden, who's affiliated with the John Locke Foundation, that says the real problem in the economy is that people are dropping out of the labor force. So it's Governor McCrory and his colleagues in the General Assembly, the leaders, keep saying it's a Carolina comeback, and it's simply not true. The lies about the tax reform plan are equally absurd. The bottom 80% of taxpayers on average, will pay higher taxes this year than paid last year. Well, think about that for a second. The bottom 80% of taxpayers on average are going to pay more because of what happened in the General Assembly. Folks who earn $1 million a year are going to get roughly $10,000 a year more. Bottom 80% are going to pay more. Millionaires are going to get a $10,000 a year break. And that's all in the name of what they call tax fairness. And now that they're actually trying to talk about tax fairness. But don't be depressed. At least things are going well. At least things are going well at HHS. And I'm not going to get into too many details. Anytime I talk about HHS, I have to stop and congratulate Governor McCrory for filling one campaign promise. I heard him many times in his 2 campaigns saying he would create high-paying jobs if he were elected governor. We just didn't know all of them would be at HHS, and they'd all have worked on his, people would have worked on his campaign. A couple more trends that are going to happen in 2014. One is, and Sharon McCloskey, our courts and law reporter, is writing about all these. There's a lot of these horrible policy decisions are now in court and are being litigated. Everything from the voter suppression bill the voucher scheme, end of career status for teachers, Racial Justice Act, and of course the redistricting lawsuit. So the courts are going to play have a big say about the final resolution of some of these things, not all of them. But it may take, obviously more than a year for some of these things to happen. And there's also a race for the states, several seats up in the North Carolina Supreme Court, which will go a long way toward determining how these lawsuits are come out. And of course, big money has flooded into North Carolina in the past in Supreme Court races, and I anticipate it will again. Now, I do think, a couple more quick things. I do think the push to privatize is not going away. I already mentioned commerce, where McCrory wants to turn over our money and transfer state employees to a largely unaccountable private nonprofit corporation, which will be giving out incentives to corporations. It's still not clear why he's doing that. We were just recently ranked as one of the more accountable economic development systems in the country, and there's a lot of evidence from a group called Good Jobs First about how in other states this kind of private system has led to corruption and a lot of other problems. The same is true for Medicaid privatization. You probably remember last year with great fanfare, Secretary Bosch and then Medicaid Director Carol Steckel came out with a plan to turn over our Medicaid program to out-of-state for-profit managed care companies. Even some of the Republicans balked, notably Representative Nelson Dollar, and they backed off. So now they have a plan to create accountable healthcare organizations and sort of piecemeal privatization. You would think HHS would strive first to be an accountable healthcare organization, but that's not happening. And even though that plan is due in March, I don't think that's going to happen in the short session. I think it's too complicated. And finally, I know I've gone on too long, and we want to take your questions. If you somehow had any doubt about the priorities of this administration, they should be erased by the announcement made, I think it was this week, of the leadership of the new NC GEAR. That's the name of it, NC GEAR, North Carolina Government Efficiency and Reform. NC GEAR. It's going to be overseen by State Budget Director Art Pope, and the key staff person who will be driving it is a fellow named Joe Coletti, who before he went to work for the State Budget Office was one of the policy people at the John Locke Foundation. Coletti wrote some of the John Locke Foundation's alternative budgets over the years, and we're going to be releasing a column and writing about that later today and the rest of this week. But the budgets that Joe Coletti wrote at the John Locke Foundation, the guy who's now overseeing the way they want to shrink government, would do things like abolish Smart Start, completely defund the Affordable Housing Coalition, raise tuition for university students by 25% a year for several years until they pay what they think is the full cost of going there, and turn Medicaid into an absurd voucher scheme. These are some of the proposals that came out of the John Locke Foundation paper written by Joe Coletti, who's now overseeing a plan to make government more efficient in their mind. So that's my brief take on 2014. I try to leave people with some hope, and I think there is a lot of hope, actually. There are two things to be hopeful about. One is, and Tom mentioned it, the same people who support raising the minimum wage with 60% in North Carolina don't support the vast majority of this agenda. The whole battle, and I'm talking about the election, I'm talking about for policies, is to make sure everybody knows about what happened and knows the truth about it. There's no Carolina comeback. There's people who can't feed their families because we cut them off unemployment. There's people that don't have health care. We're going to have drilling sideways under our towns. We had a coal ash bill recently, and we refused to regulate coal ash in North Carolina. I could go on, and people don't support all these things. They just don't know the truth about them. So that's our charge. I don't think I could get out of bed if I thought the people of North Carolina supported all this crazy stuff, but they don't, and we have to figure out a way to make sure they all know, because I think then the policies and the policymakers may be different. And with that, I think the best way to close would be, I hope I see you all Saturday at 9:30 in downtown Raleigh, because that's the easiest and most immediate and the next opportunity I think people have to voice their displeasure. But we have to do a lot more than that. We have to do a lot more than march. We have to march. We have to talk to each other. We have to talk to our neighbors. We have to be much more active, not just in politics, but in policy and influencing the folks who are trying to run our state back into the 19th century. So thanks for being here. We'll be happy to answer any questions.
So, I'm sure y'all have lots of questions for both of these fellows today. Or not. Well, let's start here back.
Where do independent voters stand in all of this? Democracy NC in a December report indicated that they're growing in registration. Democrat registration has been declining. Will the independents make a difference in who wins?
Sure. Well, the independent voters really are mad at everybody. They certainly did not support the agenda that the Republicans in the legislature pushed last summer. They don't like Governor McCrory anymore after having voted for him 2-1 in 2012. But they're not very happy with Obama either. So right now what we're finding about independent voters in the state is that they're pretty closely divided in terms of how they're sort of feeling about the two parties. They're mad about everybody. And I think that Chris is so right. We saw in July and August and September really the angriest in the time PPP's been in existence, the angriest voters in this state have ever been. I mean, they really were. Pretty much every single piece of legislation that the Republicans in the legislature were pushing was unpopular, and we were seeing numbers in terms of legislative approval that were rivaling Congress's approval rating. I mean, it was really getting down to them having that little support. And I think that the challenge for people in the progressive community over the course of this year is going to be to make sure that voters haven't completely forgotten about that when they go to the polls this fall, because voters do have a very short attention span a lot of the time, and a lot of the time, you know, we found this repeatedly since the Republicans got control of the legislature, that when they're in Raleigh and when they're in the headlines every day, voters are infuriated with them, they move more towards the Democrats, that sort of thing, but that when they go home and get out of the headlines and stop making everybody mad, that within a couple months everything's back where it was before, because it's just not at the top of voters' minds anymore. And I think Chris is also right that they're probably not going to come in for the short session and make everybody mad all over again, because they know not to, you know, they're not dumb. Their ideas might be, but they're how they do things politically isn't. So they're probably not going to make everybody mad all over again this summer, and that's just going to mean that we have to do a really good job of, you know, as a progressive community, of going to voters and reminding them what happened, so that those independents who were so mad over the summer are reminded why they were so mad come November.
In the back here, Ken.
How are environmental issues polling in North Carolina, and how should environmental groups talk about issues to the public that might affect their vote?
Well, that's the key environmental things that have happened over the last couple of years are where we really see a low level of public awareness. And it's interesting that what we find on that stuff is that you ask about fracking, 50% of voters in the state don't have an opinion about fracking. You ask about what was done with the Jordan Lake rules, 50% of voters don't have an opinion about what was done with the Jordan Lake rules. But the people who are paying attention on that stuff are opposed to fracking. And the people who are paying attention are opposed to all this lessening of restrictions on what can go into Jordan Lake. So I think there again, to the extent that the message is getting out, people are sort of coming around to seeing things the way that we do. It's just an issue of getting a higher level of public awareness, since a lot of that stuff doesn't get as much media coverage. It's not leading off the front page of the NNO a lot of the time. So there's just not the same level of awareness about that there is about a lot of the stuff Chris was talking about that's kind of been more high profile.
Right here in front of you.
In the past couple of national elections, the Democrats have gotten lucky here and there, winning Senate seats that they didn't have any right to win because the Republicans have nominated some, an extremist. We'll use neutral language. But is there some prospect that you know, there might be a surprise win somewhere around the country, perhaps here?
Yeah, two states where Democrats could pull out Senate races that are tough because of Republican primary fields that are very fragmented are North Carolina and Georgia. Democrats don't have a ton of places to play offense this year, but Georgia has an open seat where there's 4 Republicans running in the primary, 3 of whom are members of Congress, and that's not necessarily who you want to run in an open seat Senate race, as somebody who's already in Congress when Congress is so unpopular. The Democratic candidate's going to be Michelle Nunn, who was the daughter of Senator Sam Nunn, who was a longtime Georgia senator almost 60% of people in Georgia still have a favorable opinion of her father, which is just unheard of for a politician in this day and age. So that's somewhere where Georgia, you usually think of, that's a Republican state, but you combine an unusually strong Democratic candidate with potentially a weak Republican candidate emerging from the primary, you never know what might happen. And it's very much the case in North Carolina as well. If you have Kay Hagan's approval numbers, if 10% more people disapprove of you than approve of you, you ought to lose 95% of the time. But the reality is that this is a very weak Republican candidate field for the Senate, and that may allow Hagan to hang on. Voters are so unhappy with Congress, but they're also so unhappy with the legislature, so your ideal candidate is not one of the two main faces of a very unpopular legislature like you have with Tillis. And it's a case where Tillis would be the strongest candidate, even though he has so many weaknesses. You could end up with a Greg Brannon or a Mark Harris winning the primary and voters just feeling like they are too extreme to vote for in the fall. So I definitely think that even though a lot of things have not gone Senator Hagan's way over the last year, the fact that the candidate field opposing her ended up being so weak could prove to be her saving grace.
I want to get to be where we're Delaware, where we have a candidate for the Senate who has to come on TV and assure us that she's not a witch.
Or a warlock. Over there. Whichever one you want to go.
Given what you said, Tom, about how people's opinion of Obama influences sort of the down ballot, I'm curious to what you think 2014, but even more 2016, how elimination of straight party ticket is going to impact voting.
Sure. I think at the end of the day, it probably will only make a difference in races that are like really razor thin. I think that it's the kind of thing where parties are just going to have to do a lot more education to their voters, that they need to go and fill out each office individually in a way that they haven't in the past. So it's not the kind of thing that if a candidate would have won by 2 points with straight party voting, they're going to lose. It's the kind of thing I think could only make a difference in an incredibly close race. But that's another example with the straight ticket voting, and I should name a few of these things. The Republican base doesn't even support a lot of what the Republicans in the legislature did over the course of this last year. Straight party ticket voting, 70% of voters in the state think we should still have straight party ticket voting, and that's 70% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, and 70% of independents. That is not a partisan issue for your actual voters. It's something where the legislature just went and did its thing and didn't even care what its own voters thought about it. And another really great example of voters across party lines sort of disagreeing with what's going on is Chris was talking about the proposal Governor Hunt's put forward to get our teacher salaries up to the national average over the next 4 years. 80% of voters in the state support that. It is unheard of in this political climate for 80% of voters in the state to agree about anything. And that one's very similar. You have 90% of Democrats, 80% of independents, 70% of Republicans support that. But it doesn't seem like the Republicans in charge of state government want to pursue that. So, there's a lot of stuff where I think people justly get very frustrated with the Republican politicians, but actual Republican voters don't really feel, they're not hyper-political like the politicians are. They do think we should have things that make it easy to vote, like straight ticket voting. They do think we should pay our teachers reasonably. And I think that gives some opportunities to sort of create a little bit of a division between the party leaders and the party base, and maybe win some people over.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. When you're polling voters, do you get any sense of where they get their news from, and particularly their political information?
Sure. Even in an era with more news sources available than ever before, the number one place people still get news is from TV. The local news for a lot of people, 6 o'clock TV news is still the primary place that they're getting their information. So the stuff that gets covered there, that's what they're thinking about. And I think that's why, for instance, it's interesting to look at regional divides in the state about state government. people in the triangle are much more likely to still be unhappy about everything that happened in the legislative session last summer, because the triangle TV stations are covering state government pretty much all the time. Whereas if you live in Charlotte or Asheville or Wilmington, they're not covering this stuff very much outside of session. So it's interesting that as diversified as our news sources have gotten, TV is still the biggest.
This is a nitpicky thing and it irritates me. The number of businesses I go into with TVs and they're all turned to Fox News. Do we have any recourse or say so, or is it worth even expressing frustration that is forced on us?
Yeah, I think it is worth expressing frustration, because that's the kind of thing where 3 or 4 people complaining is probably enough to freak the business out and put it on, something very neutral that couldn't make anybody mad. But it's fascinating how polarized we are in our news sources. We do a big national media poll every year, and we did it last week. We looked at 8 different national TV news sources. We looked at Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, all the basic ones. Republicans trust Fox News, and they trust PBS a little bit, and they don't trust anything else. Democrats don't trust Fox News, but do trust everything else. So 7 out of 8 things we tested, Democrats said they trusted. 1.5 out of 8 things we tested, Republicans said they trusted. So it's kind of amazing the extent to which we only, especially on the right, sort of seek out sources that are going to tell us what we want to hear. And that's a big explainer of why we're so polarized.
In the back.
You said that with the election of today that Democrats would pick up seats in both the House and Senate. Could you speak either generically to the type of district or even specifically to which district that you think Republicans would be most vulnerable, the types of districts you're talking about?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to it specifically on the Senate side, because we've done a bunch of Senate polling. I think Goolsby's district still has a very good chance of going Democratic. It would have had an even better chance of going Democratic if Goolsby had run again, because people down there hate him.
The senator from New Hanover County.
Yeah, they're going to be better off with a new candidate than if Goolsby had run again. I think Democrats have a decent chance for a pickup in Wesley Meredith's district in Cumberland County. It's the only state Senate district currently held by a Republican that Obama won in 2012. I think Democrats have a decent chance of picking up Bill Cook's seat on the coast, where Stan White's running to get back his old seat and what was just an incredibly close race in 2008. So those are 3 that really off the top of my head, there's a good chance of those going back Democratic. On the House side, this is what was so, it speaks to the good job with redistricting, but in 2012, almost every legislative race in the state that was decided by 5 points or less went to the Republican. There were so many districts. Usually you'd expect that the races being decided by 1 or 2 points would split pretty evenly between the 2 parties, and they almost all went Republican in 2012 because of the gerrymandering, because they had a resource advantage. And that's the kind of thing where Democrats may have a good chance in 2014 to pick up more of those seats that were sort of split right down the middle, especially if the national attention that North Carolina has generated over the last couple years leads to more national resources coming into our legislative races this year to match the outside spending that's coming to help Republicans. There's a lot of races where another $50,000 would have let the Democrat win in 2012.
Boy, lots of questions. How's it back here?
So Chris briefly mentioned one of the races that I think could be potentially most impactful in 2014. That's the state Supreme Court race, where we have 4 seats up. In 2012, I believe it was Sam Ervin who was leading 6 points a week before the election, only to be defeated after an attack ad run just before the election by Paul Newby. What do you all think the Supreme Court race is going to look like in North Carolina in 2014? And I don't know if you've done any kind of polling on clean elections or corporate privileging on the court, but what do you think of those as potential issues in that race?
Sure. it's really hard to pull the Supreme Court races because people just don't have a clue with them being nonpartisan. This is my favorite story about that. Is in 2008 we pulled the Supreme Court race the weekend before the election. One of the candidates had 33% in the poll. One of the candidates had 31%. 36% said they were undecided. Well, half the state had already voted, had early voted. So we, we asked the early voters who they voted for, and 25% of them said they were undecided on the Supreme Court. They couldn't even remember who they voted for earlier. And we've done some polling, early polling privately about the Supreme Court races this year, and found that 80% of voters have never heard of the candidates. So it's really hard to get sort of an early take on that. It's going to come down to which side is able to run the better campaign and has more resources. People definitely in the state are not comfortable with how political the judicial races are, and I think we find that folks are uncomfortable with the amount of money that goes into that and that sort of thing. So I think that in a race where it's sort of difficult to define what the issues are, that is something that candidates could get some traction with, because voters are uncomfortable with how political that's gotten.
And speaking of how political judicial issues have gotten, one issue that we probably should call to all of your attention if you're not aware of it, something that's going on at the national level right now. Senator Richard Burr has been blocking the nomination, President Obama's nomination of Raleigh federal prosecutor by the name of Jennifer May Parker to serve on the bench for the Eastern District of North Carolina. There has never in the history of North Carolina been an African-American judge in the Eastern District, which is of course where the majority of the African-American population in the state is located, or at least the highest proportion. And this nomination was one that Burr himself had supported a few years ago. Obama made the nomination last June, and Burr has refused to return his so-called blue slip, which is meaning that even though we've gotten rid of the filibuster in the US Senate for these kinds of nominations, Senator Burr is able to sort of single-handedly block it so far. So that's an issue that you might want to file away and think about taking some action on at some point. Anyway, didn't mean to take us away from questions for Tom and Chris. Let's see, Mike Thulis.
Any comments on the use of absentee ballots this year?
We'll just have to see what happens.
Is it a good thing, a bad thing?
I mean, I think that
Strategy?
I think that with voter ID and all the laws that have been put into place, that any efforts possible to sort of reduce the gridlock on election day are going to be a good thing for progressives. But it's just a brave new world on a lot of this changes that have been made to the voting stuff, and it's gonna, I think a lot of stuff we'll just sort of have to see how it plays out.
Bill Wilson.
Tom, can you tell any polling about how voters feel about the influx of money, particularly in these campaigns, outside money, the independent expenditures, and maybe a piece of that is also, does the issue of public financing of some of the council state races and the appellate races, does that register at all with voters?
Yeah, people don't like all the spending, they support public financing, that kind of thing, but it's just so far down the list of what people are concerned about that even though they agree with what a lot of people in this room are trying to do, it's not something that they're actually going to vote on as an issue. So, people say that they hate all the spending, but they still go and vote against, whoever's been getting bashed with hundreds of thousands of dollars of negative advertising. So it's sort of something where, voters theoretically feel one way about something, but it doesn't necessarily register when they actually go to vote.
Right here in front.
Given that so many people in this state are being impacted by unemployment, underemployment, and that North Carolina, at least among states who didn't expand Medicaid, North Carolina has a pretty high number of people who are applying for health care coverage, how do you think those factors might influence people's voting decisions?
Well, I definitely think that the number one thing that sort of makes people vote one way or the other is if they're actually being personally impacted by stuff that the government's doing. So people who have had their unemployment benefits cut off or are close to somebody who has people who are having difficult getting coverage because of Medicaid not being expanded. I mean, those people are going to are going to be much more inclined to sort of vote against what's happening. It's just a question of whether there are enough of them. Because when we do polls, like, do you know anybody who's been affected by the unemployment and that kind of thing, the percentages that come back are actually pretty low. So if voters feel like, you know, this is other people's problems, it doesn't end up having as big of an impact, because unfortunately voters are pretty selfish.
Maybe, Rose, did you have a question?
So, I mean, it was a follow-on to what she just asked, is that, have you done tracking on, I know you said Obamacare is unpopular, but since we did have such a high sign-up rate, you know, are you seeing any softening in those numbers? Have you tracked?
Yeah, we've been tracking it every month, and just month after month, the support for Obamacare is in the high 30s, opposition's in the high 40s, and it really doesn't change much. I think that if Obamacare in the long run proves to be a success, those numbers will move eventually, but it's probably more of a long-term thing than something where you're going to really see it move this year. And you know, I've heard that initially Medicare was really unpopular and people weren't happy with it, and of course now that's as popular of a government program as you're going to find. So, you know, I think that if it's good just not to get too discouraged. I mean, it may be that Obamacare, you know, gives Democrats problems at the polls again this fall or whatever, but it is the sort of thing where in the long run it may help people and people may come around to really see it as a positive.
Well, last question here in the back.
Can you talk a little bit about the gender breakdown of voters and how likely women's issues could influence not just the state races, but also the congressional races, particularly since, you know, Hagan being such a leader for women's issues in the state, having started on the state level and now on the federal level, what role do you see those issues playing?
Yeah, I definitely think it could be a big thing. I mean, first of all, you have 54% of the electorate are women, so you're always going to have more female voters than males. And we really did find an incredible amount of anger about the abortion bills last summer, and especially the sort of underhanded way in which they were gone about. We found that even if a majority of Republicans, for instance, supported the new abortion restrictions that were put into place last summer, 70–80% of them didn't like the way that they were put into place. So I think that there is a climate where voters are unhappy about the way that a lot of these things were done, and it definitely has the potential to be a big thing this fall.
Well, I think we could probably go on all morning. I know people have to get to work. I'm sure our speakers will be available if you want to come up and ask them individual questions. Thank you all very much for coming. Again, February 19th, look for an announcement for a crucial conversation on immigration policy. And I think there's probably some extra biscuits out there if you want to take some. We're ordering a lot of action, so if you want to take some for your staff or something, help yourself. Thanks for coming.